So, asking a Frenchman to come to Stockholm and talk about fiber is a little bit like asking a Swede to come to Paris and talk about cheese. So I'm always in this weird position that I'm very flattered and excited that people want to hear what I have to say, but at the same time, ever since I started working in this space around 2005, this is where my eyes were set. So it's kind of an interesting position for me to be in. I also want to stress just very quickly one thing, which is that I'm a terrible speaker because the title of my presentation has changed, but also the topic of my presentation has changed, which of course is very confusing to the people organizing this stuff. But it's interesting because it flows in, I think, very nicely from what Patrick was talking about just a few minutes ago. I'm fundamentally a guy that looks at infrastructure, but not as a kind of isolated component, but infrastructure as an empowerment of anything that happens above infrastructure. And of course, smart cities is a really big topic these days. You could say it's, to a certain extent, a hype. And what I want to talk to you about today is one of the things that concerns me around smart cities, and that possibly it could be said doesn't necessarily apply here. But at the same time, first of all, Stockholm is not the only city in Sweden. And also, I think awareness of this issue is a way to perhaps structure the approach of how Swedish businesses that are taking some steps ahead of the game in terms of smart cities can address these issues in other countries and other cities. Yes, a remote. That doesn't work. Or maybe I don't know how to make it work. No, that's not it. No. Anyone knows how this is supposed to work? Apparently unrelated to Mac.
Maybe you just have to do.
Yeah, that doesn't work either. I tried that.
Technical wonders here.
Yes, I tried that too.
Okay, it's not working.
Here.
Now it's working. Okay. Good, let's go manual then. Ooh, it's working, but it's pink. Okay, white. I'll try not to move. Maybe it's my weight. Okay, so very quickly, and I'm sure you don't need to be told this, but basically the core philosophy around connected communities, which is a terminology I prefer to smart cities, because I think smart is maybe too much of a compliment, and therefore, if you're not a smart city, you're a dumb city, and it creates a kind of weird context. Basically, the idea is to use communication and ICT in general to reinvent the structure of the city in all its components: social, economic, political, relationships between the citizens and the city. All of that is part of it. So I'm not going to go in detail into what this means. I'm going to just give you a few examples of threads that can be followed in this respect. So the first thread is this relationship between the city and its citizens. Right now, to be perfectly honest, in most cities in the world, that relationship doesn't exist. We go and vote every 4 years, and that's about the only contact that we have with the city. But there are solutions that are starting to happen that change that. One of them, for example, is collaborative reporting. So the idea is, as citizens, we have the tools to actually tell the city that something is wrong. The pavement is broken somewhere, we can tell the city. There's an issue, whatever it is, there's a way to report it that is easy for the citizens, but also gives meaningful information to the city. So typically, citizens geolocating issues and reporting them, that's valuable information for the city, and it means that the citizens see action faster. So it really is a win-win type of situation. Of course, there's a lot of things around information as well, and cities are generally not very good at informing their citizens about what they're doing, what's happening, etc. And of course, it can become very political very quickly, so there's probably a right measure of information that needs to be shared. But there's a lot of value and good and healthy mechanisms that can be put in place through that. And of course, maybe to me, the most important one is the city can reinvent its own service structure through ICT and think about how they can deliver services better. I don't know how it is here in Stockholm, but in France, if you have an issue with, say, urbanization, you cannot get it solved fast. It's impossible. It's going to take you 3 days to actually get a meeting. Then you're going to go there, you're going to wait 3 hours because they've been going so late on their meetings that, and finally you're going to get someone in front of you who's going to do a kind of Brazil thing to you and say you didn't fill form 27/B, and you're going to, so, and I mean, all of these things can be avoided, but they're part of what makes life hard for people. That's one kind of general trend. Another one is around emergencies. I don't know if Christopher is going to talk about this, but we're quite lucky in Europe that we don't have a whole lot of areas where there are regular, really extreme weather events or things like that. In the US, there are entire areas of the country where you have very regularly huge hurricanes or tornadoes or all these kinds of things. There's a very interesting example of an illustration of this in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga put in place a fiber network alongside its electricity network that connects the whole city, and all of the electricity system is completely intelligent in Chattanooga. And I think it was last year they had a major hurricane hit the city, and they brought everything back up in a day. And the last time that it happened, it had taken 9 days. The economic and, of course, welfare impact of that is enormous. And so this is the kind of thing that are really both valuable to cities and to citizens. To a certain extent, I mean, some of the things highlighted here in the service to citizens that Patrick has spoken about as well, with boarding passes and things like that, around security. I mean, I don't want to go through the whole thing. There's a lot of applications, and I don't have a whole lot of time. But it's very important that we understand that these things are to the benefits of both parties. Both the city and the citizens are to benefit from that. The point I want to make and where I want to get to is that there is an infrastructure issue behind all of this. And it's not just an issue because the infrastructure in some instances is not there. It's also a conceptual issue. So if I look at a layered view of what a smart city is to me, it starts with a passive infrastructure on top of which, for most of these services, there's a network of sensors that are either wired or wireless. It doesn't really matter. These sensors generate data. That data is fed into an application, and that application brings the benefit to the users. It's a very conceptual view of basically any of the services I've mentioned, and the hundreds more that we have examples of would be conceptualized like that, right? But the issue that I see is this. Most smart cities that I have looked into have a project thinking approach, right? They have an issue, let's solve that issue. So, for example, you have an issue with traffic. We have an example in the city of Nice where they really had major issues with the traffic flow in the city. Too many cars, not enough space. And this is an old city, all the buildings are listed. You can't do anything physical to deal with that issue. So they put a system in place. And by the way, the issue that I'm going to raise doesn't apply specifically to Nice, in case there's anyone from Nice following. But basically, if you put in place a traffic flow system to make traffic smoother in the city, you're gonna start from the top, right? So how are we gonna do it? What do we want users to be able to do that makes things easier? You're gonna design the application, you're gonna figure out what type of data you need to aggregate that, you're gonna put the sensors in place, and then you're gonna contract out to an operator for the infrastructure, because that's not your job, right? And then you have an issue with waste management. You're gonna do the same, go from the top, go all the way down. You do 10 of those, you have 10 separate logical infrastructures. You're paying for each of these services for an infrastructure again and again and again. The OpEx is going to kill you. The operational cost of running it like that is going to kill you. So in effect, the model is not sustainable. You cannot develop a smart city like that. And unfortunately, what I see everywhere is that this is how they're thinking. It's interesting that Patrick ended his speech on transverse platforms, because this is kind of what I'm talking about. It's all silos, and the layers that could be transverse and apply to every single system are either not there or not even understood. There's no conceptualization that this is an issue. The way I think that it should happen is that at the very least, the passive infrastructure and the sensor network should be a transverse infrastructure. So that's one of the key aspects, I think, that will either accelerate or slow down the development of smart cities. So what infrastructure are we talking about? I mean, that's the real question. Now, the people from Stokab here know that I'm rather an advocate of cities taking these matters into their own hands, but I'm also very aware that it's not the only option available. But in this particular context, let's look at what's available and how it can be used, right? In most places in the world, in most places in the developed world, there's going to be an incumbent copper network. And in most places, that network can be tapped into. You can purchase access to that network on certain conditions. However, that network has capacity constraints. It's limited on download, it's very limited on upload. And remember, we're putting sensors everywhere, and these sensors are uploading data, they're not downloading data. And it has a very high latency. So when you're doing a traffic flow optimization program, you need to be acting in absolute real time. Sometimes a few seconds or half a minute of delay will actually make the system take the wrong decision, because by the time it takes a decision, something else has happened. So from that point of view, it's not an optimal infrastructure to be doing this. And of course, there's going to be some wireless stuff, either as a substitution to that or on top of that. But most of the wireless networks today have the same constraints. And also, we have to remember that a wireless network is essentially a wired network with a wireless end to it. So if the underlying wired network is not up to scratch, you can deploy the best wireless technology in the world, you're still going to get crappy wireless. It's really important to keep that in mind. One of the advantages, though, of the existing copper network, and again, I'm stressing in developed markets, because in the developing world, ubiquity is not one of the key features of the existing incumbent network generally, but is this idea that it's everywhere. And as a city, you're not deploying a service for half the city, you're deploying a service for the whole city. So you need ubiquity, it's absolutely vital. Another issue with the incumbent copper is low-level access. The way that you're going to access that network, and again, it's wireless extensions as well, is that it's basically a commercial offering that is usually tied to the endpoint. So for each endpoint that you deploy, you're going to pay something every month to the operator. And at the same time, we hear all of the vendors talking about the Internet of Things and the hundreds of billions of endpoints that we're envisaging. It's clear that that model is not sustainable. So accessing that network, either on a retail basis or a wholesale basis, is an issue. Of course, in some markets, you have competitive networks, and when you're lucky, these competitive networks are fiber and not copper. there the capacity constraints disappear. So you could argue that if that's the network you access, or if it powers the wireless on top of it, you're good. The problem is that private operators cherry pick. They don't deploy everywhere. They deploy everywhere they're convinced they have a business model. And again, as a city, that means they deploy to a half or two-thirds of your city. But the poorest areas, or the areas where the houses are dispersed, or where city planning, for whatever reason, makes it complex because there's historical buildings, or that the pavements have to be redone in a certain way, they're not going to do them. So you, again, have issues with coverage. You have no, generally, low-level access to those networks because they're private operators. They have no obligation to resell, and they have no intention of reselling in most instances. So basically, you're left with either renting lines from them, which is very expensive if you're just sticking one sensor on the end of it, or nothing. So not really an option. And of course, the third approach is what was done here in Stokab, is you have a municipal or a local utility fiber network. You don't have capacity constraints because it's fiber. In theory, or at least from my experience, most of these networks are ubiquitous. And they're ubiquitous because as a city, you don't think of this as, let's give something to the half of the city that has the most money. That's not how you think. Because you have control over the infrastructure, you have low-level access. And the infrastructure is generally open most of the time because it's a municipal infrastructure. And therefore, you can have a fine-grained cost model that will actually fit with your needs. Now, this is extremely leading, okay? And I'm very clear on that. But the point I want to make is this, is today's operators do not understand this. And therefore, the whole M2M pricing model issue is that it simply does not apply to an idea of multiple city applications that all require the same type of infrastructure but with different sensors and different endpoints. The way of charging that the operators envisage today is simply incompatible with this long term. It can work to power one or two applications today, and this is the state the market is in, so we haven't really seen this issue yet. But it won't work to power 10 or 15 applications. And this is the cities of tomorrow. So I'm not saying that you need to have your own municipal fiber network to enable the smart city movement in a city. What I am saying is, if you do have it, you're definitely one step ahead. And furthermore, if you don't have it, then you have to make the private operators on the market understand that they cannot power it with the current technologies or current structure of their offerings. And again, it's not just an issue with bandwidth and capacity and latency. It's also an issue with how it's priced. It's really, really important to keep that in mind. Of course, one of the ways out of this is that the private players who are looking at deploying competitive fiber networks to the incumbent are probably better partners to make something happen in a public-private partnership. There's a way that you can tell these guys, well, you are going to do 2/3 of the city. I'll give you, or I'll invest in your vessel or whatever funding mechanism is put in place to make that 100% on the condition that I can get low-level access for my own needs. And they're generally okay with these kinds of deals because it makes their life easier. It expands their network footprint at no cost. There's no reason they shouldn't be happy with this. But the point, I guess, in conclusion that I want to make is we're only going to get smart cities if the underlying infrastructure is state-of-the-art, if it's open, and if it's ubiquitous. Thank you very much.